She stood there frozen, staring at the embossed wedding invitation that had just been torn from her hands. The groom, her own nephew, looked at her with cold eyes and said the words that would change everything. "Actually, Aunt Rachel, we've decided to keep the guest list intimate. You're not invited anymore." What he didn't know was that Rachel wasn't just any guest. She was the fire marshal responsible for approving the venue's capacity and that beautiful mansion they'd rented. It was about to face the most thorough inspection of its existence. "Hey, beautiful souls. This is Tina, and I'm so glad you're here with me today. You know, I always say this space is ours, a place where we can sit together like old friends over coffee and talk about life, about those moments that test us, shape us, and sometimes completely transform us. Today, I'm bringing you Rachel's story, and let me tell you, this one hit me right in the heart. It's about family betrayal, professional dignity, and that moment when the universe lines up perfectly to show people exactly who they're dealing with. If you've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or pushed aside by people who should have loved you most, this story is going to resonate with you deeply. Stay with me until the very end, because the way this unfolds is absolutely incredible. And there's a lesson here for all of us about standing in our power with grace. And hey, if you're loving what we do here, tap that like button and subscribe so we can keep sharing these powerful stories together. Now, let me tell you about Rachel. Rachel Morrison had spent 23 years serving the city of Portland as a fire safety inspector and marshal, building a reputation that was beyond reproach in a field where precision and integrity meant the difference between life and death. She wasn't the type of woman who needed to announce her credentials or wave her authority around like a badge of honor. She was quiet, methodical, and deeply committed to her work, the kind of professional who could walk into any building and within minutes identify every violation, every risk, every shortcut someone had taken thinking no one would notice. Her colleagues respected her. Building owners feared her inspections, and event planners knew that getting Rachel Morrison's signature on a capacity approval meant their venue was genuinely safe, not just technically compliant. She had shut down weddings, corporate events, and even a mayoral fundraiser once because the occupancy limits were being dangerously exceeded. And she had done it all without apology because she understood something fundamental that many people didn't. Rules written in fire codes weren't suggestions or bureaucratic nonsense. They were lessons learned from tragedies, written in the pain of families who had lost loved ones to preventable disasters. Her personal life was quieter than her professional one, marked by a devoted marriage to Thomas, a high school history teacher whose steady warmth balanced her analytical precision, and by her role as the reliable aunt in a sprawling family where she'd always been the one people called when they needed help, advice, or just someone to show up. Her nephew Brandon had been special to her since the day he was born 28 years ago, the first baby she'd ever held, the little boy who used to fall asleep on her lap during family gatherings while she told him stories about brave firefighters and buildings that stood strong against every storm. She'd been there for his first day of school, his high school graduation, his college acceptance, every milestone documented in her memory with the same careful attention she gave to floor plans and exit routes. When Brandon had called her 6 months ago to announce his engagement to Melissa, a real estate developer's daughter with a taste for luxury and a social media presence that seemed to define her entire existence, Rachel had been genuinely happy for him. Happy that he'd found someone who made him smile, even if she privately wondered whether Melissa's carefully curated online persona matched the reality of who she was behind the filters and ring lights. The engagement had been a whirlwind of expensive decisions and escalating extravagance, with Melissa's parents funding a wedding that seemed designed more for Instagram content than for actual human celebration of love and commitment. Rachel had watched from the sidelines as the plans grew more elaborate, as the guest list expanded to include people Brandon barely knew, influencers and business contacts, and Melissa's sorority sisters from college, while the original intimate gathering he'd described became a 300-person spectacle complete with celebrity DJ, imported flowers, and a 7-tier cake that required its own structural support system. She'd smiled and nodded through it all, offering help where she could, listening to Brandon's occasional doubts when he called her late at night, wondering if maybe things were getting out of hand, reassuring him that wedding planning was stressful for everyone and that what mattered was the marriage, not the party. Then came the invitation, delivered to her door 3 months before the wedding date. An elaborate affair with gold foil lettering and silk ribbon that probably cost more per unit than most people spent on actual gifts. Rachel had opened it with Thomas beside her, both of them admiring the craftsmanship even as they privately wondered about the expense, and she'd immediately marked the date on her calendar, blocked out the entire weekend, and started thinking about what gift might be meaningful for a couple who seemed to already have everything. She'd even requested that particular Saturday off from work, something she rarely did because fire safety didn't take weekends off and someone always needed to be available for emergencies. But this was Brandon's wedding, and she'd been looking forward to it with the kind of anticipation that came from genuine love and familial pride. 2 weeks ago, everything changed in a single phone conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes but managed to crack the foundation of assumptions Rachel had built about her place in her own family. Brandon had called on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with an emotion she couldn't quite identify, somewhere between embarrassment and defensiveness, and after some awkward small talk about the weather and Thomas's upcoming school play, he dropped the bomb with all the grace of a demolition crew. Melissa's parents were concerned about the guest list, he explained, his words coming faster, as if speed could somehow soften the blow. They'd gone over budget, way over, and some difficult decisions needed to be made about who could attend and who couldn't. And after careful consideration with Melissa and her family, they decided that they needed to prioritize Melissa's professional network and extended family, people who were important to her career and her parents' business relationships. And unfortunately, that meant some of Brandon's more distant relatives would need to be cut from the list, and he was really sorry, but that included Rachel and Thomas. Rachel had stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, completely unable to process what she was hearing because the words seemed to be in English, but they weren't making any sense in the context of 28 years of being Brandon's aunt, of being someone he'd called family, not just in the biological sense, but in the real, meaningful, showed up when it mattered sense. She'd asked him to repeat himself, certain she'd misunderstood, and he'd done so with increasing discomfort, explaining that it wasn't personal, that they still loved her and Thomas, that maybe they could do dinner after the honeymoon to celebrate privately, but the wedding itself was going to be limited to immediate family and essential guests. And apparently she didn't qualify as either. She'd asked, her voice remarkably steady considering the emotional earthquake happening inside her chest, whether his parents were still invited, whether his father's brother and his family were still invited, whether the cousins she'd watched grow up alongside Brandon were still invited, and his silence before answering told her everything she needed to know before he confirmed that yes, they were all still coming. It was just that some adjustments needed to be made and sacrifices required, and she should understand that wedding planning was complicated. Rachel had ended the call with a polite goodbye that betrayed none of the hurt coursing through her, had walked calmly to her bedroom, and had allowed herself exactly 15 minutes of tears before Thomas found her and held her while she explained what had happened. His anger had been immediate and protective, ready to call Brandon himself and demand an explanation that made sense, but Rachel had stopped him because she understood something he didn't yet. This wasn't really Brandon's decision. This was Melissa and her family's influence, and Brandon had simply been too weak or too infatuated or too invested in keeping his future in-laws happy to stand up for the aunt who had always stood up for him. The hurt was still there, raw and aching, but beneath it, something else was beginning to stir, something that felt like clarity, like the moment during an inspection when all the pieces suddenly aligned and she could see exactly what was wrong with a building safety plan and exactly what needed to happen next. She'd spent the following week in a strange emotional state, going through her work with her usual precision while internally processing the rejection and what it meant about family, loyalty, and the assumptions we make about our place in other people's lives. Then, exactly 9 days after Brandon's call, Rachel walked into her office on a Monday morning to find a new assignment waiting on her desk, a routine capacity approval request for a private event venue scheduled for occupancy review that week. She'd picked up the file with the same professional detachment she brought to every job, scanning the basic details before the address jumped out at her like a neon sign in the darkness. Whitmore Estate, the historic mansion on the hill overlooking the Willamette River, a property that had been recently renovated and reopened as a premium event space. And according to the application, it was scheduled to host a private wedding on the exact date that Brandon had uninvited her from. Rachel had stared at that address for a full minute, her mind making connections at lightning speed because she knew that venue. She knew it was expensive and exclusive and exactly the kind of place Melissa would choose for maximum social media impact. And the probability of this being a coincidence was so astronomically small that she couldn't even pretend to believe it. She'd pulled up the full application with hands that were completely steady despite the adrenaline suddenly coursing through her system. And there it was in black and white. Applicant name Melissa Chen and Brandon Morrison, event type wedding reception, expected attendance 280 guests, with a note that the venue had been recently purchased and renovated by Chen Development Corporation, which she immediately recognized as Melissa's father's company. The universe, Rachel thought with something between amazement and grim satisfaction, had a sense of irony that bordered on poetic justice, because the nephew who had revoked her invitation to his wedding had apparently failed to mention to his bride and future father-in-law that his Aunt Rachel was the fire marshal who would be inspecting and approving the venue they'd chosen. Or perhaps he had mentioned it and they'd been arrogant enough to assume it wouldn't matter. That she'd rubber stamp the approval like some formality that stood between them and their perfect day. Rachel had called the venue manager that afternoon to schedule the inspection, identifying herself by title and explaining that new event spaces required thorough capacity evaluations before they could legally host large gatherings, her voice professional and neutral, giving no indication that she had any personal connection to the event in question. The manager, a nervous young woman named Sophie, who was clearly new to the position, had been accommodating to the point of anxiousness, explaining that Mr. Chen had personally overseen the renovations and was very confident everything was up to code, that they'd spared no expense in making Whitmore Estate the premier venue in Portland, and that the wedding scheduled for next month was extremely important to the family, and could Rachel possibly expedite the process? Rachel had responded that safety inspections operated on their own timeline, that thoroughness could not be rushed, and that she'd conduct her evaluation according to standard protocol, which meant a comprehensive review of exits, occupancy calculations, fire suppression systems, emergency lighting, and structural capacity, and she'd be there Thursday morning at 9. Thursday had arrived with overcast skies that matched Rachel's mood as she drove up the winding road to Whitmore Estate, her inspection equipment loaded in the trunk, her clipboard prepared with the standard evaluation forms she'd filled out hundreds of times before, and her mind carefully compartmentalized into the professional space where personal feelings couldn't interfere with the objective assessment of safety compliance. The mansion was undeniably beautiful, a restored Victorian with modern amenities hidden behind historical facades, the kind of venue that photographed like a fairy tale and probably cost more per hour than most people earned in a month. Sophie had met her at the entrance with a smile that looked painted on, and a nervousness that intensified when she realized Rachel wasn't going to rush through a cursory glance, but was instead methodically measuring rooms, counting exits, testing door mechanisms, and examining the building with the intensity of someone conducting a criminal investigation. The problems had started revealing themselves within the first hour, small things initially, like emergency exit signs that weren't properly illuminated, and fire extinguishers that were mounted too high to meet accessibility requirements, violations that were correctable, but indicated a lack of attention to detail that made Rachel's professional instincts sharpen with suspicion. Then, she'd moved to the main ballroom, the centerpiece of the venue where Brandon and Melissa's reception would take place, a soaring space with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered breathtaking river views. And as she'd carefully calculated the square footage and measured the exit widths and counted the number of doors, the numbers had started telling a story that made her jaw tighten with professional anger that had nothing to do with personal grievance and everything to do with genuine safety violations. The ballroom's maximum safe capacity, calculated according to the fire code using the formula that accounted for exit capacity, floor space, and emergency egress time, was 140 people for an event with tables and chairs, a number she double-checked 3 times because she needed to be absolutely certain before she documented it. The application Melissa had submitted claimed the space could safely hold 280 guests, exactly double the actual capacity. A discrepancy so egregious that it couldn't possibly be an honest mistake, but had to be either deliberate fraud or incompetent calculation. And either way, it represented a dangerous situation that could lead to tragedy if an emergency occurred during a packed event. Rachel had stood in the center of that beautiful, photogenic ballroom and imagined it filled with nearly 300 people. Imagined a fire starting in the kitchen, or a structural failure, or any of the disasters she'd studied throughout her career. Imagined those people trying to evacuate through exits that were inadequate for that volume. Imagined the panic and the crush and the preventable deaths that would follow. And her resolve had hardened into something unshakable. Sophie had appeared at her elbow, asking if everything looked good, her voice pitched high with hope. And Rachel had turned to her with an expression that made the young manager take an involuntary step backward. The ballroom was over capacity by 140 people. Rachel had explained in a voice that was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. And the application as submitted was denied pending corrections and resubmission. And furthermore, there were multiple code violations throughout the venue that needed to be addressed before any capacity approval could be granted for any event. Sophie's face had gone white, and she'd stammered something about Mr. Chen being very particular about the wedding happening as planned, about how important this event was, about whether there was any flexibility in the interpretation of the codes. And Rachel had looked at her with the expression she reserved for people who suggested that safety regulations were negotiable, and explained very clearly that fire codes weren't suggestions. They were legal requirements backed by decades of tragedy and written to prevent deaths. And she didn't care if the president himself was getting married in that ballroom. If it couldn't safely hold the number of people they planned to pack into it, the event wasn't happening. Before we go on, I just want to pause here for a second and say something from my heart. If you're still with me, if Rachel's story is hitting home for you, I see you. I see everyone who's ever been pushed aside by family, who's been made to feel like you're not important enough, not valuable enough, not worth the effort. This community we're building here, it's for us, for people who understand that our worth isn't determined by someone else's guest list. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you had to stand up for yourself when family let you down. Your story matters, and I promise you, I read every single comment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do, because we're creating something special here, a space where real stories get told and real healing happens. Now let's get back to Rachel, because you are not going to believe what happens next. The phone call from Richard Chen came exactly 3 hours after Rachel had left Whitmore Estate with her denial documentation, and his tone carried the kind of aggressive confidence that came from a man who was used to money-solving every problem and authority bending to his will. He'd introduced himself as the owner of both the venue and Chen Development Corporation, father of the bride, and someone who was very concerned about what he was hearing from his venue manager regarding completely unreasonable restrictions being placed on his daughter's wedding. Rachel had listened to his opening statement with professional patience, waiting for him to finish his rehearsed speech about his company's reputation and the quality of their renovations and the multiple engineers who had assured him everything was perfectly safe before she'd responded in a voice that was pleasant but absolutely unmovable. Mr. Chen, she'd explained, the capacity calculations weren't her personal opinion or arbitrary restrictions. They were mathematical formulas based on exit widths, floor space, and emergency egress requirements that were standardized across the entire fire safety industry, and his venue as currently configured could not legally hold the number of people his daughter planned to invite. Period. Richard had shifted tactics then, his voice taking on a tone of attempted camaraderie, suggesting that surely there was some room for interpretation, that Rachel seemed like a reasonable person who understood that these codes were designed for generic situations and didn't account for the high-quality construction and premium safety features his company had installed. That perhaps if she came back for another inspection with a fresh perspective, she might find that her initial assessment had been overly conservative. Rachel had felt something cold settle in her chest at that suggestion, recognizing it for what it was: a carefully worded attempt at corruption, an invitation to compromise her professional integrity in exchange for making his problem disappear, and her response had been immediate and sharp enough to cut through his pretense. She was not going to reinterpret fire codes to accommodate his event, she'd stated flatly. The calculations were objective and based on measurements that wouldn't change, regardless of how many times she inspected the property. And if he'd like to dispute her assessment, he was welcome to file a formal appeal with the fire marshal's office, where it would be reviewed by her supervisor. But he should know that her supervisor was a 30-year veteran who had trained her personally, and who was even less inclined than she was to overlook capacity violations that put lives at risk. The conversation had deteriorated rapidly after that, with Richard's civilized veneer cracking to reveal the bully underneath, his voice rising as he informed her that he had connections at City Hall, that he played golf with the fire chief, that she was making a serious mistake if she thought she could obstruct his family's plans without consequences. And did she have any idea who she was dealing with? Rachel had let him finish his tirade, had waited through the theatrical pause he'd left for her to presumably panic and backtrack. And then she'd responded with a calmness that came from 23 years of dealing with men exactly like him. Men who thought their money and connections made them immune to the rules that protected everyone else. She'd explained very slowly, as if speaking to someone who was having difficulty processing information, that threatening a city official in the course of their duties was illegal, that she was recording this conversation, as was her right under Oregon law, that his connections were irrelevant to whether his building met fire code, and that if he continued to harass her, she would add his behavior to her official report and recommend additional scrutiny of all his company's properties. The silence that followed had been profound, and when Richard had spoken again, his voice had been tight with barely contained rage, informing her that she would regret this, that he would make sure she regretted this, before hanging up abruptly. Rachel had sat in her office after that call, her hands slightly unsteady from the adrenaline but her resolve completely unshaken, and she'd immediately documented the entire conversation in a formal memo to her supervisor along with the inspection findings and capacity denial. Her supervisor, a gruff man named Captain Reynolds, who had seen every variety of corruption attempt and intimidation tactic in his 3 decades of service, had read her report with increasing approval before looking up at her with something like pride. "This is exactly right," he'd told her. "Exactly the kind of integrity we need. And don't worry about Chen's threats because we've dealt with his type before, and they're all bluster until they realize we actually can't be bought or scared off. And if he does try to go over our heads, he's going to find out that the fire chief he supposedly plays golf with takes code violations even more seriously than we do." Reynolds had then made a decision that Rachel hadn't expected, but that filled her with grim satisfaction. He was elevating the Whitmore estate situation to a full compliance investigation, which meant not just the wedding venue, but all of Chen Development's properties would be subject to thorough inspections, because in his experience, when someone was willing to cut corners this egregiously on their daughter's wedding venue, they were probably cutting corners elsewhere too. The next phone call had come from Brandon, and this time there was no pretense of courtesy or family warmth, just cold anger that made him sound like a stranger. His voice had been sharp when she'd answered, demanding to know what she thought she was doing, whether she was really so petty and vindictive that she would sabotage his wedding just because her feelings were hurt about not being invited, whether she understood that she was destroying the most important day of his and Melissa's life because of some personal grudge. Rachel had let him speak, had absorbed his accusations with a heaviness that settled around her heart like lead, and when he'd finally run out of steam, she'd responded in a voice that was quiet, but carried more disappointment than anger. She'd explained that she hadn't known the venue was his wedding location when she was assigned the inspection, that the violations she'd documented were real and serious and had nothing to do with their personal relationship, that her job was to ensure public safety, and she'd taken an oath to do that job without favor or prejudice, regardless of who was involved, and that if he genuinely couldn't understand the difference between professional duty and personal revenge, then maybe he didn't know her as well as she'd thought he did. Brandon's response had been to accuse her of hiding behind procedure, to insist that she could approve the venue if she wanted to, but was choosing not to out of spite, to demand that she fix this immediately because Melissa was having a breakdown, and her parents were threatening to cancel everything, and his future in-laws now thought his family were vindictive people who couldn't be trusted. Rachel had listened to this man who she'd held as a baby, who she'd encouraged through every challenge and celebrated through every success, reduce her to a villain in his narrative, and something inside her had finally broken free from the hope that he might still see reason, might still remember who she was and what she meant to him. She'd told him calmly that the venue could still host his wedding, just with 140 guests instead of 280, that it was his choice whether to adjust his plans to comply with safety regulations or to find a different venue, but that she was not going to risk people's lives, including his own, so that Melissa could have the oversized spectacle she'd planned. She'd added, her voice finally showing a crack of the hurt underneath, that she'd spent 28 years believing she was important to him, that she mattered, and if this situation had taught her anything, it was that family was supposed to protect each other, not weaponize their love as a bargaining chip for social status and Instagram aesthetics. Brandon had hung up without responding, and Rachel had sat in the silence that followed, feeling the finality of something breaking, a relationship that had been foundational to her sense of family and identity crumbling under the weight of his choices and priorities. The formal complaint arrived at the fire marshal's office 2 days later, submitted by Chen Development Corporation and co-signed by a law firm that specialized in municipal code disputes, alleging professional misconduct, biased inspection practices, and abuse of authority by Fire Marshal Rachel Morrison. The document was 23 pages of carefully worded accusations designed to make Rachel appear vindictive and incompetent, claiming that she had conducted an improper inspection, applied incorrect calculation methods, and was pursuing a personal vendetta against the Chen family due to an unstated conflict of interest. It demanded her removal from the case, a new inspection by a different marshal, and an investigation into whether she had violated ethical guidelines in her conduct. Rachel had read through the complaint with Captain Reynolds standing beside her, both of them noting the careful omissions in the document, how it failed to mention Richard Chen's threatening phone call, how it misrepresented the actual violations found, how it attempted to frame safety regulations as negotiable guidelines rather than legal requirements. Captain Reynolds had been blunt in his assessment. This was a standard intimidation tactic from people with money and lawyers, designed to make the problem go away by burying it in paperwork and formal procedures that most people would find too exhausting to fight through. But they'd picked the wrong office and definitely the wrong inspector to try this with, because he'd been dealing with exactly this kind of bullshit for 30 years. And he had a file drawer full of similar complaints that had all ended with the building owners either complying with codes or finding themselves facing criminal charges for operating unsafe venues. He'd told Rachel not to worry, that he would handle the complaint response personally, that her inspection was absolutely solid and would hold up under any scrutiny, and that, in fact, the formal complaint had just given him justification to expand the investigation into all of Chen Development's properties, because if they were willing to lie in official documents about one building, they were probably lying about others. The story had leaked to the media 3 days after that, probably through someone at Chen Development who thought public pressure would succeed where legal intimidation had failed. And suddenly, Rachel found herself at the center of a news cycle she'd never sought or wanted. A local TV station had run a segment about a fire marshal denying permits for a young couple's wedding, with carefully edited interviews that made her look like a bureaucratic tyrant destroying dreams for the sake of petty regulations. And the station had included tearful footage of Melissa talking about how her perfect day was being ruined by someone on a power trip. The social media response had been immediate and brutal, with thousands of people who knew nothing about fire codes or inspection procedures flooding Rachel's professional social media with messages calling her heartless, cruel, a bitter woman, taking out her own failed relationships on innocent couples, someone who should be fired and banned from ever working in public service again. Rachel had watched the storm build with a strange detachment, understanding intellectually that mob mentality fed on incomplete information and emotional manipulation, but still feeling the weight of so much collective hatred directed at her from people who had formed their opinions based on 60-second news clips and social media posts. Thomas had wanted her to respond publicly, to tell her side of the story, to explain about Brandon and the real safety violations and the intimidation tactics, but Rachel had refused because she knew from experience that trying to argue with a mob was like trying to bail out the ocean with a teaspoon, pointless and exhausting and ultimately self-destructive. She told Thomas that the truth would come out eventually, that her job was to do her work correctly and let the official processes handle the rest, and that if people wanted to believe she was a villain based on incomplete information, there was nothing she could say that would change their minds until they were ready to see the full picture. The turning point had come from an unexpected source, a veteran investigative journalist named Patricia Summers, who had spent 40 years covering municipal corruption and had developed a nose for stories where the official narrative didn't quite add up. Patricia had called Rachel directly, identifying herself and explaining that she'd been following the wedding permit story, and something about it felt wrong, too neat, too emotionally manipulative. And when she'd started digging into Chen Development Corporation, she'd found a pattern of code violations and inspection disputes across multiple properties that suggested this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather standard operating procedure for a company that valued profits over safety. Would Rachel be willing to speak with her on the record about the actual inspection findings and what had really happened? Rachel had agreed immediately, grateful that someone was finally asking about the facts rather than just the emotions. And she'd spent 3 hours walking Patricia through the inspection report, the capacity calculations, the threatening phone calls, and the timeline that proved she'd been assigned the inspection before she'd even known it was Brandon's venue. Patricia's story had run 4 days later as a front-page feature in Portland's largest newspaper, and it had been everything Rachel could have hoped for. A meticulously researched piece that included interviews with fire safety experts who confirmed Rachel's calculations were correct. Documents showing Chen Development had been cited for violations on 6 other properties in the past 2 years, and most devastatingly, information about a warehouse fire 8 years ago at a Chen property where inadequate exits and overcrowding had resulted in 3 deaths and multiple injuries. The article had laid out in clear language why capacity limits existed, what had happened historically when those limits were ignored, and how Rachel's refusal to approve an overcrowded venue wasn't bureaucratic pettiness, but literally the difference between a safe event and a potential tragedy. Patricia had also uncovered and published the detail that Rachel was Brandon's aunt and had been uninvited from the wedding, adding that context not to suggest bias, but to demonstrate the personal cost of her professional integrity. The fact that she'd enforced safety regulations, even when doing so meant burning bridges with family, and subjecting herself to public vilification. The public response had shifted almost overnight, with the same people who had called for Rachel's firing now praising her courage and integrity, apologizing for their initial reactions, and redirecting their anger toward Chen Development and Melissa's family for trying to manipulate public opinion and intimidate a public servant who was literally trying to keep people from dying. Melissa's social media posts about the wedding being ruined were suddenly flooded with comments pointing out that she could still have a wedding, just with fewer guests, and asking why she thought her Instagram aesthetics were more important than the safety of her guests. Brandon had tried to post a defense of his fiancée and her family, but it had been ratioed so severely that he deleted it within hours, and the hashtag that had briefly trended calling for Rachel to be fired was replaced by a new one celebrating her as an example of professional ethics and personal courage in the face of corruption and intimidation. Captain Reynolds had called Rachel into his office the day after Patricia's article ran, and his expression had been unreadable until he'd closed the door and then broken into the widest smile she'd ever seen on his usually stern face. The fire chief wanted to see her, he'd explained, and before Rachel could panic, he'd clarified that it was for a commendation, not a reprimand, because her handling of the Chen situation had been textbook perfect, and the department wanted to recognize her publicly for maintaining integrity under pressure. Furthermore, the investigation into Chen Development's properties had uncovered violations serious enough that the city attorney was considering criminal charges. 3 of their venues had been temporarily shut down pending compliance. And Richard Chen's connections at City Hall had mysteriously evaporated once it became public knowledge that his company had a history of safety violations, and that he'd tried to intimidate a fire marshal into overlooking them. The commendation ceremony had been held at City Hall with local media present, a formal acknowledgement of exemplary public service that Captain Reynolds had presented personally, while explaining to the assembled officials and reporters exactly what Rachel had done and why. It mattered. The fire chief had spoken about the responsibility that came with protecting public safety, about the pressure that inspectors faced from wealthy developers and politically connected families, and about why it was crucial that people like Rachel Morrison existed in city service. People who couldn't be bought or intimidated or swayed from doing their jobs correctly, regardless of personal cost. Rachel had stood there in her dress uniform, accepting handshakes and praise from people she'd worked with for years, and she'd felt a complicated mixture of pride and sadness because this recognition was wonderful, but it didn't change the fact that Brandon still wasn't speaking to her and her family had fractured in ways she didn't know how to repair. The wedding had been postponed indefinitely, according to social media posts from Melissa, that managed to be simultaneously bitter and vague, blaming unnamed circumstances and difficult people without directly acknowledging that those difficult circumstances were her father's company, trying to host an overcrowded event in a venue that didn't meet safety codes. Brandon had sent Rachel a single text message 3 weeks after the commendation ceremony, a brief note that said he understood now that she'd been doing her job, but that he hoped she also understood why he couldn't have a relationship with her anymore, because Melissa's family blamed her for destroying their wedding plans, and it was just too complicated to maintain family ties under those circumstances. Rachel had read that message multiple times, searching for any hint of the nephew she'd loved, finding instead only a weak man who had chosen the path of least resistance over loyalty and integrity, and she'd responded with equal brevity, telling him she understood his choice and wished him well, but that he shouldn't contact her again because she had no interest in maintaining a relationship with someone who valued social convenience over family. The months that followed had brought unexpected developments that felt like the universe continuing to balance scales that had been tipped unfairly for too long. Chen Development Corporation had lost its commercial lending relationship with the city's largest bank after the safety violations became public, which triggered a cascade of financial problems that ultimately forced Richard Chen to sell off several properties, including Whitmore Estate. The venue had been purchased by a hospitality company that specialized in historic preservation and immediately began a comprehensive renovation to bring it into full code compliance, and they'd hired Rachel as a consultant on the project, paying her consulting fees that were triple her city salary to ensure every aspect of the building met or exceeded safety requirements. Melissa had broken off the engagement 6 months later, a decision that had apparently blindsided Brandon completely, and according to family gossip that reached Rachel through sympathetic relatives, Melissa had admitted that she couldn't marry someone whose family was full of difficult people who didn't understand how to support them properly, by which she apparently meant that she couldn't marry into a family that included someone who wouldn't compromise safety regulations for wedding aesthetics. Brandon had reached out then, a longer message this time, full of apologies and regrets, explaining that he'd been wrong, that he should have stood up for Rachel, that he'd let Melissa and her family manipulate him into betraying someone who had always been there for him. And could they possibly reconcile because he'd lost his fiancée, and he didn't want to lose his aunt too? Rachel had sat with that message for a long time, feeling the pull of old affection and familial obligation, wanting to forgive him, because that's what family was supposed to do. But ultimately recognizing that some betrayals changed relationships permanently, not because the hurt was unforgivable, but because they revealed truths about character that couldn't be unseen. She'd responded kindly but firmly, explaining that she forgave him for his sake, not hers, that she hoped he learned and grew from this experience, but that their relationship had been fundamentally altered by his choices, and she needed to protect her own peace by maintaining boundaries that didn't allow him back into her inner circle of trust and affection. The case had become something of a legend in fire safety circles, used in training seminars as an example of how to handle pressure from influential people and maintain professional integrity in difficult circumstances, and Rachel found herself occasionally invited to speak at conferences where she would tell the story without the personal details, focusing instead on the importance of regulations and the human cost of safety violations. She'd met other inspectors and marshals who had faced similar situations, people who had been threatened or bribed or publicly vilified for refusing to compromise standards, and there was a kind of solidarity in those conversations, a mutual recognition that their work was often invisible when done right, but became headline news when they refused to do it wrong. I want to pause again here, dear friends, because we're in the thick of it now, and I need you to feel what Rachel felt in these moments. This is where the story stops being about revenge or justice and becomes about something deeper, about knowing your worth even when the people who should love you are telling you you're wrong. I want to hear from you in the comments, really hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and standing in your truth? Have you ever lost people you loved because you refused to compromise who you are? Tell me your story, because this space is safe and we're all learning together. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Because we're not just watching stories, we're healing together, growing together, becoming the people we were always meant to be. Your presence here matters more than you know. Now, let's see how Rachel's story comes full circle. Thomas had been her rock through everything, never questioning her decisions, never suggesting she should have handled things differently, just standing beside her with the quiet strength that had defined their marriage from the beginning. On the night after she'd sent her final message to Brandon, establishing those boundaries that felt both necessary and heartbreaking, Thomas had held her while she cried for the relationship that used to be, for the little boy who had trusted her completely, for the man he'd become who had proven himself unworthy of that trust. But Thomas had also reminded her of something she'd been too close to the situation to see clearly, that by refusing to compromise her integrity, she hadn't just protected the 280 people who would have attended that wedding. She'd also sent a message to every other developer and venue owner and person with money and influence who thought they could pressure city officials into ignoring safety regulations. And that message was going to save lives she would never know about, in situations she would never hear about, because her stand had reinforced the principle that these codes existed for everyone's protection and weren't negotiable regardless of who was asking for exceptions. The unexpected gift that came from the whole situation was the relationships that deepened and revealed themselves as truly solid in ways Rachel hadn't fully appreciated before everything happened. Her parents had been unequivocal in their support, her father actually calling Brandon to tell him in no uncertain terms that he'd raised his grandson better than this and was deeply disappointed in the man he'd become. Her mother organizing a family dinner to which she deliberately didn't invite Brandon's immediate family, while making sure Rachel knew she was surrounded by relatives who understood the difference between right and wrong. Rachel's younger sister, who had always been somewhat distant, had driven 6 hours to spend a weekend with her, bringing wine and old photo albums and the gift of just being present without trying to fix anything or offer advice. Just acknowledging that the situation was painful and unfair, and that Rachel deserved better from the people who claimed to love her. Colleagues she'd worked with for years, but never socialized with outside the office, had reached out with messages of support, sharing their own stories of family betrayals and professional challenges, creating connections that transformed coworkers into genuine friends. The fire department had made changes too, implementing new protocols for handling intimidation attempts and documenting threats against inspectors, creating a formal support system for employees who faced retaliation for doing their jobs correctly, and establishing a legal fund to defend city workers who were sued or formally complained against by people trying to avoid code compliance. Captain Reynolds had cited Rachel's case specifically when presenting these changes to the city council, explaining that protecting the people who protected the public was not just good policy, but moral imperative, and that the city had a responsibility to ensure that doing the right thing didn't come with unbearable personal cost. Rachel had been asked to help draft some of these new policies, lending her experience to creating systems that would support the inspectors who came after her. and there was something deeply satisfying about turning her painful experience into structural changes that would make the job safer and more sustainable for others. Whitmore Estates' renovation had been completed 8 months after the original inspection that started everything, and the hospitality company that now owned it had thrown a grand reopening event to showcase the changes and celebrate their commitment to both historical preservation and modern safety standards. They'd invited Rachel as the guest of honor, a recognition she'd initially wanted to decline because she didn't need public celebration, but Thomas had convinced her to attend because her presence would send an important message about the value of doing things correctly even when it was difficult. The event had been beautiful, the ballroom restored to its Victorian elegance, but now equipped with proper exits, updated fire suppression systems, clearly marked emergency lighting, and a certified capacity of 140 people that was prominently displayed at every entrance. The owner had given a speech thanking Rachel specifically for her integrity and thoroughness, explaining to the assembled guests that her refusal to compromise had ultimately saved their investment because a venue with a reputation for safety would always be more valuable than one with a history of violations, and that they were proud to operate a space where people could celebrate life's important moments without risking their lives in the process. Rachel had toured the renovated building with a sense of professional satisfaction that was deeper than pride, walking through spaces that were now genuinely safe, seeing exits that were properly sized and marked, noting fire extinguishers mounted at correct heights and sprinkler systems that met current standards, and knowing that every person who celebrated in this building from this day forward would be protected by regulations that she'd refused to compromise. A young couple had approached her during the reception following the tour, introducing themselves as engaged and explaining that they'd chosen Whitmore Estate specifically because of its reputation for safety, that they'd read about her inspection and the changes that followed, and that as someone who had lost a cousin in a nightclub fire years ago, the groom wanted to shake her hand and thank her for being the kind of person who took those regulations seriously even when it cost her personally. The conversation had lasted only a few minutes, but Rachel carried it with her long after the event ended, a tangible reminder that the abstract concept of public safety had real faces and real families attached to it, people who were alive and unharmed specifically because someone had refused to cut corners or bend rules or prioritize convenience over compliance. That young groom's cousin had died in exactly the kind of situation that Rachel prevented every day, trapped in an overcrowded space with inadequate exits when fire broke out. And while she couldn't bring back that lost life or heal that family's grief, she could honor it by continuing to do her job with the same uncompromising integrity that had defined her career and cost her a relationship she'd valued deeply. The first anniversary of the inspection that changed everything arrived with autumn colors painting Portland in shades of gold and crimson, and Rachel marked it privately by visiting the cemetery where her grandmother was buried, the woman who had raised her with firm principles about right and wrong and the importance of standing for something even when standing alone. She told her grandmother's headstone the whole story, talking out loud in the empty cemetery about Brandon and Melissa and the wedding that never happened, about the threats and the public vilification and the eventual vindication, about the family relationships that had broken and the unexpected ones that had strengthened, about the professional recognition and the policy changes and the lives saved that she would never be able to count. Her grandmother would have been proud, Rachel knew, would have told her that integrity was often lonely but never worthless, that doing the right thing cost something because if it was free, everyone would do it, and that the measure of a person's character was found in the moments when no one was watching or when everyone was watching and demanding you compromise what you knew to be true. She'd received a letter that week from the State Fire Marshals Association, informing her that she'd been selected for their annual award recognizing exceptional service and professional courage, an honor that came with a monetary prize and an invitation to speak at their conference about maintaining ethical standards under pressure. The letter had praised her specifically for demonstrating that public service meant serving the public's genuine interests, even when powerful private interests demanded otherwise, and for showing newer inspectors that the system would support them if they had the courage to do their jobs correctly. Rachel had accepted the award with genuine humility, understanding that she was receiving recognition not because she'd done something extraordinary, but because she'd simply refused to do something wrong. And the fact that this qualified as exceptional said something troubling about how normalized corruption and compromise had become in systems that were supposed to protect people. The speaking engagement at the state conference had been challenging in unexpected ways, standing before an audience of fire safety professionals and trying to articulate lessons from an experience that was still emotionally raw despite the time that had passed. She'd talked about the importance of documentation, of recording threatening phone calls and keeping meticulous notes, of understanding that doing your job correctly sometimes meant accepting that people would hate you and that relationships would end, and that you had to be okay with that cost, because the alternative was compromising safety and living with the knowledge that your weakness might one day contribute to preventable deaths. She talked about finding support systems, about not trying to weather these storms alone, about the necessity of having supervisors who would back up their inspectors and policies that protected city workers from retaliation. And she talked about the unexpected gifts that came from standing firm, the way crisis revealed who people really were, the relationships that proved themselves genuine and the ones that proved themselves conditional, the clarity that came from understanding your own values deeply enough to defend them even when defense was costly. The questions from the audience had been thoughtful and sometimes uncomfortably personal, with younger inspectors asking how she'd dealt with the social media harassment, how she'd managed to keep doing her job while being publicly vilified, whether she'd ever doubted herself or wondered if maybe she was being too rigid in her interpretation of codes. Rachel had answered honestly, admitting that yes, there had been moments of doubt, times when she'd questioned whether this one inspection was really worth destroying her relationship with Brandon. Moments when the sheer volume of public hatred had made her wonder if everyone else was right and she was wrong. But then she'd remember the mathematics of the situation, the objective reality that 280 people in a space rated for 140 was dangerous regardless of how she felt about it. And she'd remember the young groom at Whitmore Estate talking about his cousin who died in an overcrowded nightclub. And the doubt would dissolve because the facts didn't care about her feelings or Brandon's wedding or Melissa's Instagram aesthetic. The facts simply were. And her job was to honor those facts even when honoring them was hard. A veteran inspector from Southern Oregon had raised his hand during the Q&A and shared that he'd faced a similar situation 15 years earlier, had caved to pressure from a city councilman to approve an overcrowded venue. And that venue had experienced a fire 6 months later that killed 2 people and injured 17 others, and he'd carried that guilt every day since, knowing that those deaths were partially his responsibility because he'd been too weak or too afraid to do his job correctly. The room had gone silent as this man spoke, his voice breaking with emotion that 15 years hadn't healed. And he'd looked directly at Rachel and told her that her courage in the Chen development situation had inspired him to be more rigorous in his own inspections, to never again prioritize someone's comfort over someone else's safety, and that she should know her stand had ripple effects she would never fully see. Rachel had thanked him with tears in her eyes, understanding in that moment the full weight of what she'd been carrying and why it mattered so much. Not just for the specific people at Brandon's wedding, but for everyone who would ever attend an event in a venue that someone inspected according to conscience rather than convenience. The months continued to unfold with a rhythm that gradually felt less like survival and more like actual living, the acute pain of Brandon's betrayal fading into a duller ache that she carried, but that no longer dominated her emotional landscape. She'd thrown herself into her work with renewed energy, taking on additional training responsibilities within the department, mentoring younger inspectors who were just learning how to navigate the political and ethical complexities of the job, sharing her experience as a kind of inoculation against the pressures they would inevitably face. She'd also started volunteering with a nonprofit that advocated for stronger building codes and fire safety education, using her newfound public profile to raise awareness about why these regulations existed and what happened when they were ignored or weakened by lobbying from developers and business interests that prioritized profit over safety. Thomas had surprised her on their wedding anniversary with a weekend trip to the coast, just the two of them in a small bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean. And on their last evening there, he'd held her hand across the dinner table and told her something she hadn't realized she needed to hear. He was proud of her, not just for what she'd done professionally, but for how she'd handled the personal cost, for the grace she'd shown, even when she had every right to be bitter, for the way she'd transformed pain into purpose and used her experience to make systems better for others. He'd also told her, his voice gentle but firm, that it was okay to grieve the relationship with Brandon, that she didn't have to pretend it didn't hurt, or that she was completely fine with how things had ended, that acknowledging loss didn't diminish her strength or compromise her principles. It just meant she was human, and the situation had genuinely cost her something valuable. Rachel had cried then, finally giving herself permission to feel the full weight of the grief she'd been pushing down in favor of professional composure and public strength. And Thomas had held her while she mourned not just Brandon, but the version of family she'd believed in, the assumption that blood ties and shared history meant something unbreakable that couldn't be fractured by something as mundane as a wedding invitation or as serious as a safety inspection. The resolution came almost 2 years after the initial inspection, arriving in a form Rachel never expected and initially didn't want to accept. Brandon had requested a meeting through Rachel's sister, explaining that he'd been in therapy for over a year, that he'd done extensive work on understanding his own patterns of people-pleasing and conflict avoidance, and that he wanted to speak with Rachel not to ask for reconciliation, but simply to apologize properly, to acknowledge specifically what he'd done wrong, and to take full responsibility without excuses or expectations of forgiveness. Rachel's first instinct had been to decline, to maintain the boundaries she'd established because they'd brought her peace. But her sister had gently suggested that sometimes closure required a final conversation, and that Rachel might regret never hearing what Brandon had to say, even if what he said didn't change anything about their relationship status. They'd met at a neutral coffee shop on a Tuesday morning, both of them arriving early and awkward, and Rachel had been struck by how much older Brandon looked, the easy confidence of his youth replaced by something more tentative and worn. He'd started by thanking her for agreeing to meet, acknowledging that she had no obligation to give him this time. And then he'd done something Rachel hadn't expected. He'd apologized without qualifications, without but statements that deflected blame, without attempts to explain away his behavior as misunderstanding or poor judgment. He'd said clearly and simply that he had betrayed her, that he'd known it was wrong when he did it, that he'd chosen his relationship with Melissa and her family over his relationship with the aunt who had loved him unconditionally his entire life, and that nothing about his circumstances excused those choices or made them less harmful. He'd acknowledged the specific ways he'd hurt her, uninviting her from the wedding, attacking her professionally when she was doing her job, accusing her of vindictiveness when she was acting with integrity, choosing to believe the worst about her rather than standing up for someone who had stood up for him countless times. Brandon had also told her about the aftermath she hadn't known about, how the broken engagement had sent him into a depression that forced him to finally examine his patterns of behavior, how therapy had helped him see that he'd spent his entire adult life trying to avoid conflict by agreeing with whoever was in front of him, how he'd sacrificed his own values and the people who genuinely loved him in pursuit of acceptance from people whose approval was conditional and ultimately worthless. He'd shared that his parents had also been in therapy working through their own complicity in the situation, recognizing that they'd raised him with messages about keeping peace and maintaining appearances that had left him emotionally unprepared to stand up to someone like Melissa's father, or to choose difficult integrity over easy compromise. He'd told Rachel that he didn't expect her to forgive him or to restore their relationship, that he understood some damage was permanent regardless of how much growth happened afterward, but that he needed her to know that she'd been right about everything, that her stand had likely saved lives, including potentially his own, and that he was sorry it had taken losing her to understand the value of what he'd thrown away. Rachel had listened to all of this with carefully controlled emotions, not wanting to make it easier for him by crying or softening too quickly, needing him to sit with the full weight of his confession without her rushing to absolve him of discomfort. When he'd finished speaking and looked at her with eyes that were clearly bracing for rejection, she'd taken a slow breath and told him that she appreciated his apology, that it was clear he'd done genuine work to understand what happened, and that she forgave him not because his apology earned forgiveness, but because she'd already decided to forgive him for her own peace, regardless of whether he ever apologized at all. She'd explained that forgiveness didn't mean restoration, that she'd rebuilt her life in a way that had healthy boundaries around who had access to her trust and vulnerability, and that while she wished him well and hoped he continued to grow into someone who could stand by his values, their relationship would remain distant and cordial, rather than returning to the closeness they'd once shared. Brandon had nodded, his eyes filling with tears he didn't try to hide, and he'd thanked her for her honesty, for not giving him false hope, for respecting him enough to tell him the truth about where they stood rather than offering empty platitudes about time healing everything. He'd asked if it would be okay if he sent her a card at holidays, nothing expecting a response, but just to maintain some small thread of connection. And Rachel had agreed to that, understanding that sometimes relationships couldn't be what they were, but could still exist in diminished form. They'd parted with a brief hug that felt both familiar and foreign, and Rachel had driven home feeling lighter than she'd expected, realizing that closure didn't require reconciliation. It just required truth-telling and the release of hope for outcomes that weren't going to happen. The story of Rachel Morrison and the wedding that never was had eventually faded from public attention the way all stories eventually do, replaced by newer scandals and different dramas. But its impact continued in ways both visible and invisible. Whitmore Estate thrived under new ownership, becoming known as the safest and most compliant venue in Portland, attracting clients who valued that reputation and were willing to adjust their guest lists to fit actual capacity rather than fantasy numbers. Chen Development Corporation had been sold after Richard Chen's retirement, the company's reputation too damaged to continue under family ownership, and the new ownership had implemented comprehensive safety reviews across all properties and brought in Rachel as a paid consultant to oversee the compliance process. The fire department had expanded its inspector protection program based on the protocols developed after Rachel's case. And over the 2 years since the incident, they'd documented 14 other situations where inspectors had been threatened or pressured and had successfully defended all of them without any inspector having to stand alone the way Rachel had. Rachel herself had been promoted to deputy fire marshal, a position that gave her more oversight responsibility and allowed her to shape department culture around the values she'd defended. And she'd used that platform to advocate for stronger enforcement mechanisms and better support systems for inspectors facing pressure from politically connected developers. She'd also finished writing a book about her experience, working with Patricia Summers to craft a narrative that balanced personal story with policy analysis, examining how systems of power operated to compromise public safety and what structural changes were needed to prevent corruption at the municipal level. The book was being published by a university press and was already being adopted as a textbook in public administration programs, ensuring that her experience would educate the next generation of city workers about the importance of integrity and the costs of compromise. On a cool evening in late October, exactly 2 years after the inspection that had changed her life, Rachel stood at the window of her office, looking out at the Portland skyline, and thought about paths not taken, about who she might have become if she'd approved that venue to keep peace with Brandon, if she'd compromised her standards to avoid conflict, if she'd chosen temporary comfort over permanent integrity. That version of Rachel would have kept her nephew in her life, would have avoided the public vilification and the professional complaint and the family fracturing that had been so painful to endure. But that version of Rachel would also have carried a different weight. The knowledge that she'd betrayed her oath and potentially endangered lives, the fear that her weakness might someday contribute to tragedy. The slow erosion of self-respect that came from knowing she could be bought or scared or manipulated into abandoning what she knew to be right. She thought about the young groom at the Whitmore Estate reopening, about his cousin who died in an overcrowded nightclub, about all the nameless people attending events in venues that were safe because someone somewhere had refused to approve them when they weren't, about the invisible tally of prevented tragedies that was the real measure of her career's success. She thought about the inspectors she'd mentored, who now had frameworks for handling pressure and documentation procedures for protecting themselves, about the policy changes that had emerged from her case, about the book that would teach future public servants about the necessity of choosing difficult right over easy wrong. And she thought about herself, about the person she'd become through this crucible, more aware of her own strength, more careful about where she placed her trust, more certain about her values, and more willing to defend them even when defense was costly. Thomas appeared at her office door, having stopped by after school to take her to dinner, and he smiled at her with the warmth that had sustained her through everything. "Ready to go?" he asked, and Rachel nodded, gathering her things and turning off her office light. As they walked to the car, Thomas asked her if she was okay, noticing the reflective mood, and Rachel considered the question seriously before answering. She was okay, she told him, more than okay actually, because she'd learned something crucial about herself over the past 2 years, that she was someone who could stand alone when necessary, someone whose integrity wasn't conditional on other people's approval, someone who could lose relationships and withstand public hatred and still wake up every morning certain that she'd made the right choices for the right reasons. It wasn't the lesson she'd wanted to learn, wasn't the way she'd wanted to discover her own strength, but it was the lesson she'd needed, and she was grateful for it, even while acknowledging that the education had been painful. They drove through the Portland evening, past buildings that Rachel had inspected and venues she'd approved, and places where people gathered without knowing that someone had carefully calculated their safety. And Rachel felt at peace with the complicated story of the past 2 years, with the choices she'd made, and the costs she'd paid, and the person she'd become. Somewhere in the city, Brandon was living his own life, learning his own lessons, carrying his own regrets, and she wished him well with genuine sincerity, even while maintaining the boundaries that protected her peace. Somewhere, other inspectors were facing their own pressure from developers and politicians and people with money who thought rules didn't apply to them. And because of Rachel's stand and the systems built from her experience, those inspectors had better tools and stronger support and clearer examples of what integrity looked like when it was tested. The wedding that never happened had become a story with unexpected endings, not the fairy tale Melissa had planned with her Instagram aesthetic and overcrowded ballroom, but something more real and more valuable, a testament to the importance of standing for something, to the cost and worth of integrity, to the truth that our real character is revealed not in moments of ease and agreement, but in moments when doing right means losing people we love and facing consequences we never wanted. Rachel Morrison had passed that test, had discovered depths of strength she hadn't known she possessed, had transformed personal pain into systemic change that would protect people she would never meet. And in the end, that was a better story than any wedding could have been, a narrative not about celebration and spectacle, but about substance and character, and the quiet courage of doing what's right even when no one is watching, or when everyone is watching and demanding you do what's wrong. And as Thomas reached across the car to hold her hand, Rachel smiled, knowing that she'd found her way through the fire and emerged not unscathed, but undestroyed, carrying scars that had meaning and strength that had been tested and proven true.